Hi, everyone. I'm Valentina Flores, CEO of Red Century, and this is the Ctrl-Alt-Secure podcast where we talk to business leaders about all things cybersecurity. And today's going to be a little bit different because we're not talking about your tech stack specifically, but we're going to be talking about your team. And when I moved into tech leadership and cybersecurity leadership, I didn't realize how big of a population there were of neurodivergent individuals. And being neurodivergent myself, it really caused me to just learn so much about it. And I think it's helpful for every business leader to know the people on their team and how they think. And so I have two really cool guests with me today, Andy and Fred, who specialize in this area. And so although we're not talking to security, we are talking to security leaders and tech leaders about just how to run your team better and more proactively and with better competitive advantage. So I'm really excited for today. So Andy and Fred, thanks for being here. Andy, if
Thank
you
you.
want to start off and just kind of give me your background and what you do at Irregular Training.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having us, Valentina. It's nice to be here. So, my name's Andy. I am one of the co-founders of Irregular Training, along with Fred, who I'll allow to introduce himself in a moment. My background is predominantly in actually the charity and social care sectors, but I've been working in training and development now for about 7 years, and have done some consulting work, both around neurodivergence, but also around other subjects. So I've both worked directly with neurodivergent people for many years, and I'm also neurodivergent myself. I have a diagnosis of autism, and we started irregular training around in the last year, I would say, didn't we, Fred?
Yeah. Pretty much a year ago,
Last year,
maybe a little bit less.
yeah, yeah. But we've been working in the sort of similar field for for a decent chunk of time now.
Mm.
What about you, Fred?
Yeah, so I'm the other co-founder of Irregular. My background's actually in sales. So I've worked in sales for about 15 years since I was in my early 20s. And I needed to make some money and I didn't have any qualifications or marketable skills. So sales was kind of the only avenue available for me. It felt like it was. Um, but I was able to do very well at it and build a career out of it. Um, and yeah, work for some reasonably large tech companies, places like OpenTable and Toast. And eventually went into training, but kind of similar kind of time. I I went down the route of getting I was diagnosed with ADHD, so a little bit different to Andy. And it sent me on this journey of discovery of trying to understand how my brain worked and how other people's brains worked, and how these differences in people's brains um, showed themselves at the workplace. And that's kind of the journey that started and ended, or is still going, but at this point is at this place where we've developed this business called Irregular.
Yeah, no, and I'm so happy to have you guys today. And, I'm diagnosed with OCD and ADHD and then a couple other intersecting things. And it's just something we don't talk about often and we're not allowed to talk about. And it's avoided a lot in hiring conversations. And for me, like you said, that journey of learning how your brain works, like that's when I became more successful, is when I learned how to, like, what my brain was doing and how to work with it. So I think it's a really important conversation and just really opening up about this stuff. And, I hope the leaders can, even if they're not neurodivergent themselves, use this to understand their teams a little better. Um, so, obviously neurodiversity, I feel like the term is being used more often. We gave examples, OCD,
Mm.
ADHD, autism. Um, but not everyone like fully understands what that means in practice. So how do you define it? And then how is it relevant specifically in the tech field?
I'll start this one off. So I think that the term neurodiversity can be a little bit mystified sometimes, if that's the right word I'm looking for, like the opposite of demystified. Um, it's really quite a simple describing word. It just describes something which is real, which is that everybody's brain is a little bit different. Is physically a little bit different. Like this blob that sits in the middle of your head, that's comprised of however many millions of neurons and things like the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus and the basal ganglia, like all these parts of the brain variations in their size or their activity or how they interrelate with each other, which many of which are caused by genetics. And then with each person, it's also massively influenced, possibly mostly influenced by your actual life experience. It results in everybody walking around with a slightly different brain inside their head. And that just means that people experience the world differently. They understand things differently. They process information differently. They typically have things that they find easier and things that they find more difficult. So that's just reality. And that's what the word neurodiversity describes, the same way that biodiversity describes all these different strains of flora and fauna. Neurodivergence is this word that's developed to describe people who seem to be a little bit different from most people, right? And that's where you get these ideas of autism and ADHD and dyslexia, OCD, right? I think when it comes to the workplace, what this means, if everybody's got a different brain, which means that they experience the world differently and they behave differently and they're better at some things and they find other things harder, this means that people need different conditions to do their best work. And I think what we see, and this is a bit of a generalization, but I think what we see in the world of work, and I think the world of tech is probably, no exception to this, might be better in some ways, might be worse in some other ways, is a tendency towards standardization, which a lot of people would say is kind of a consequence of even something like the Industrial Revolution, right? Factories, this idea of kind of creating this repeatable machine and this process that produces results. A lot of workplaces are still set up according to that basic principle. And of course, that is not very tolerant of difference, right? So yeah, people with different brains can struggle. And what that means is that they can't bring their strengths to bear. And that's probably, that's the biggest problem. So the way that me and Andy talk about it is this isn't yes, it would be good to improve individual experience, but the real alarming thing for a business or a business leader is this talent that's being left by the wayside, that's being underutilized, these strengths that aren't being allowed to blossom and aren't being allowed to influence. So yeah, I think that's the big issue that we have today.
Yeah, and I think in tech specifically, it's interesting because in my experience, at least, there's a much larger number of neurodiverse people in tech.
Mm,
And part of that is unfair pigeonholing, which we'll talk about. But
mm,
even like a lot of our clients, for example, are also neurodiverse. And yet we
mm,
still have these business norms of small talk and talking about the weather. And, you know,
yeah,
we don't care about that. And so I think it's interesting that even in a culture where there's predominantly neurodiverse people, we still have this antiquated one size fits all business norm from 100 years
mm,
ago. And
mm,
not many companies are really breaking out of that.
mm,
And so I think it's changing more and more, but I think that's the big issue in tech is it's not like there's just one or two individuals on the team who aren't fitting into this one size fits all. It's a very large portion of the team that are all masking and all hiding and all trying
mm,
to work inefficiently. So that's
mm,
what I see on the tech
mm.
side.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I think the world is moving so fast now. And tech is driving that. It really is. The advances in technology are just mind-numbingly fast, and a standardized approach kind of requires the environment to be stable, right? It requires that control, and the environment really isn't stable. It probably hasn't been for a very long time, but it certainly isn't now. So that kind of standardization becomes fragility.
Yeah. And Andy, like from your perspective and, lived experience, can you kind of give examples of like unique strengths that professionals bring to the workplace that are usually overlooked?
Yeah, of course. What one of the things that I always talk about when I'm delivering content on this, and something that we build into our work as a kind of front and center message, is that the success that a lot of neurodivergent professionals have had in their life is often framed as being in spite of their neurodivergence, that they have overcome a barrier or a challenge in some way. And I guess practically speaking, there is some truth to that. But I also think it's fair to say that neither me nor Fred could have achieved the things that we have achieved in our careers were it not for our neurodivergence. Things that I'm good at and the things that I bring to the table and the success I've had, you can't separate that from my autism. It is a direct result of my autism. Um, and I think a lot of neurodivergent people would tell you the same thing, that the way that neurodivergence is currently spoken about and treated in the language that we use and in the way that we accommodate it. I mean, even the word accommodate, right? Even that, it's treated as a problem to be overcome. It's treated as an issue to be made room for. And I think that we need to challenge that. We need to challenge that thinking. We need to challenge it in our language. We need to challenge it in the concepts that we bring to the table. We need to challenge it vocally as neurodivergent people, because I'm not successful in spite of my autism. I'm successful because of it. And what that looks like, I think, for me, is that my autism brings an ability to identify and focus on detail that others might miss. I can pull together information, summarize it very clearly and concisely, because I see patterns in information and I can pull out themes and ideas from large amounts of data and information very quickly. And that's something a lot of autistic people will talk about, their pattern recognition skills and their attention to detail. Similarly, I've always been faster at my work than my colleagues. And that sounds like a boast, and it isn't designed to be. It's designed as a statement of fact that in my career, I have always finished work faster than others. I've always been more productive than other people. Um, and that's because of my hyper focus. And I know that's something that a lot of neurodivergent people, both autistic and with ADHD, will share, that if we are locked into something, we'll work on it very quickly. We'll complete it to a high standard in a short amount of time. And that's, there's another aspect of this as well. And that is that, generally speaking, if you're autistic, you will want to complete work to a very high standard. Similarly, when me and Fred work together, we both are natural perfectionists. We both want to make sure that the things we produce are as high quality as they possibly can be. And that's not because we want to progress in our careers, and it's not because we want to look good in front of others. It's because it's important to us. It's important to us as people. And that is an aspect of our neurodivergence, which is tangled up with it. You can't remove it. We are that way because of our neurodivergence. But the truth is that, as we all know in the room, to talk about the strength that neurodivergent people bring, I could talk about it for days and days and days, because every neurodivergent person is going to be excellent at some things and is going to struggle with some other things. And that's the nature of the ways our brains work. But, there are incredible things that neurodivergence in particular brings. For autism, that might be pattern recognition, it might be focus, it might be attention to detail, it might be honesty, it might be integrity. For ADHD, that might be creativity, it might be innovation, it might be charisma, it might be crisis management, it might be diligence. And all of these things we want to use, we want to bring. They can add a huge amount of value. But in order to access those things, we also need to make space for the things that we find difficult. And I think that's a big part of how me and Fred frame this.
Yeah, and I think a big part of it is, the hiring process in general. Everyone's asked about strengths and weaknesses, right? In every job interview. But when it comes to
Yeah.
neurodivergence, we talk about we avoid talking about scattered, or like people with
Mm,
autism are going to be awkward socially at the water cooler, and not
mm,
all those strengths you just mentioned. And I think, and I don't know if this is our generation, but it just feels like I never heard about any of the strengths until
no,
much later in life.
never.
And like Fred said, that kind of like late exploration, I think a lot of people still don't name those strengths, within their diagnosis. So I think that's a really good point. And Fred, working in like that high pressure corporate world, is probably really different. So did your company kind of reframe neurodiversity, or how did you kind of change that from a challenge to an advantage in those types of industries?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that a lot of salespeople are ADHD. I think it's a massive. There was a point where I thought that ADHD was actually a prerequisite to be a salesperson. Right? It's that very very to be a salesperson. The most important thing is that you want to be a salesperson. You want to put up with the pressure and the constant rejection and the kind of hunting around for deals and like the kind of chaos at the end of the month and all that kind of thing. Most normal people don't want to do that, right? Whereas an ADHD person with their kind of constant state of understimulation, they're attracted to that kind of high stakes situation, even though it's not always positive stimulation, it's always stimulation. You're going from one thing to another, a lot of interpersonal relation, which ADHD people tend to be very, very good at, being able to really tune into people and pick up on subtle cues and subtle differences, subtle messages. So yeah, 100%. My brain was the reason that I was able to be successful in a sales role. But the other side of it is that there's this in sales and perhaps in many departments, there's this kind of desire from the top down for control and predictability. It's like, how many sales are you getting? Like what's our revenue going to be? Where are we going to be in 6 months' time? Projections and forecasts. They probably happen in the shareholder meeting or the investor meeting, and then they kind of dribble down to the salespeople. And there's so much emphasis, like that number is so important that the typical reaction when it looks like, a company isn't going to hit that number is to exert control, is to try and control it. Right. Okay. We need to hit that number so bad that we're going to we need to tell the salespeople they have to do this number of meetings. They have to record it in the CRM tool. They have to tell us exactly how many sales they've got coming in next week. And it's this situation where you're trying to control uncontrollables, right? You're trying to like harness and tame the natural uncertainty and unpredictability of the world, right? And so that's a struggle for a lot of salespeople, having to spend a lot of time doing admin or being pulled up for the fact that you do no admin, which is very, very common and certainly was in my case. But I think that it's an interesting thing in sales where the kind of qualities that ADHD people bring to the table are sought after. But to kind of talk to Andy's point of this situation where you want to have your cake and eat it. It's like, right, we want all your strengths and we want all your advantages, but we are going to penalize you for the things that you're weak at. And you can't do that. You can't have one without the other, you know? So I think that to really use neurodivergence in general as a competitive advantage, you need to start creating these conditions where so-called weaknesses, like for example, for ADHD people, maybe just being erratic, right? Which is very, very common, right? It's this deregulation, right? I can be absolutely brilliant, but I can't necessarily be brilliant when you want me to be brilliant. And I might be absolutely terrible sometimes, right? It's this disparity rather than being kind of a 7 out of 10 all the time. It's like being a 10 out of 10 quite often, sometimes being like a 3 out of 10. So how can organizations create an environment where those weaknesses can be integrated in order to be able to take advantages of the strengths?
Yeah, and I think to your point about sales, and obviously we're all talking in terms of diagnoses, but like you said, everyone's brain is different, and there are certain brains that lead more to sales, and certain people that lead more to, software development and things like that. Um, but there's also kind of like going too far. There's this stereotype that people kind of like belong in these like back end roles. I
Mm,
think especially those of us who don't enjoy, like the small talk and the networking and, like that kind of stuff. And that's why so many people are put into coding kind of by default. So, I think that's part of challenging it as well is like, what is this person's actual skill set instead of trying to pigeonhole those
Mm,
roles.
mm,
But I
absolutely.
think it's very interesting that you were in sales, and I think that's something I try to push a lot is that, generally I don't always like people, and sometimes I, need to have a day with no interaction. But it doesn't mean I'm not good at sales because when I'm in a call, I can predict everything they're about to object to, and I can think of these resources, and I can, spiral in my head while they're talking. And there's so many different advantages in sales besides that charisma aspect. And then in coding,
100%.
there's so much more to it than, like, let's put you in the back of the house because, you're a little bit weird. So that's what especially in tech, I hope people can kind of start to open up those stereotypes.
Yeah, and I know Andy would like to say something about this, but I think that's exactly it. It's this idea that there's a preset way of doing something. And I think sometimes what organizations will do is because, again, it's this kind of fear of the unknown, right? They have these outcomes that they want to reach and they want it so bad that they feel like they need to, like, how do we give ourselves the absolute best chance of this happening? And often that kind of stereotype of the way something should be done is almost becomes like a shortcut for, like, right, maybe if we just look for those people that kind of fit that stereotype, that will give us the best. That's what salespeople are like, right? Let's hire loads of those people, or that's what coders are like, right? Let's hire loads of those people. But that becomes like a bit of a straitjacket, and it stifles innovation because it means that people don't have the freedom to try different approaches to achieve outcomes.
Yeah, I think one of the really amazing things about neurodivergence is that we fundamentally see the world differently. Like we have a different experience of the world, right? We process sensory information differently, and we interpret things differently, and we think differently. And the risk that you take when you sort of create boxes for neurodivergent people, as in, get a bunch of people with ADHD to do sales, get a bunch of autistic people to do coding, is that, yeah, I mean, yeah, I can understand why people with ADHD might naturally be good at sales and why people with autism might naturally be good at coding and data analysis, right? There's some nugget of truth to that. But what good are we doing if we are bunching a bunch of people who see the world differently and have all these unique perspectives all into the same room, and whether a bunch of people all see the world the same way that they do, rather than utilizing some of that and bringing it into areas where that viewpoint is underrepresented, right? And this is something I experienced a lot in my career because I don't think I could be any further away from coding and data analysis, right? I'm in a people-based job, and I always have been in a person-based job. And um, and my primary career is training. I get up in front of a room of people and I talk to people. And that surprises people. That surprises people that an autistic person would do that. But the truth is that I'm good at that because I'm autistic, right? I have lots of experience of masking. I have lots of experience of performing. So the act of delivering training is very comfortable to me because I know how to pretend to be things. I know how to act a certain way. I know that when I stand up in a room to deliver training, I know that I need to play the part of an engaging person, and I can be engaging as a result of that because I know what it means to be engaging. But I've also operated at senior leadership levels within social care organizations. I've done consulting work with charities. I've worked in the homelessness sector and the domestic abuse sector. And, you know, I don't think anybody would say that I don't have people skills. Autism is not something that wipes us of our ability to be charismatic or interesting or social. It just means that there are some additional things that we have to do in order to achieve those things. And it means that we sometimes do those things slightly differently than others. But, I spend a lot of time around neurodivergent people, and I've found that as time goes on, I'm more and more certain that there really isn't any job that an autistic person can't do. And there really isn't any job that somebody with ADHD can't do. It's about whether that job is accommodating the needs of those people. And I think one of the reasons why you see an overrepresentation of people with ADHD in sales, for example, is because that environment accommodates people with ADHD. That role provides people with ADHD with something that they enjoy and that works well for them. And the reason why data analysis and coding has a overrepresentation of autism is because that role naturally accommodates autistic needs. You don't have to speak to a lot of people, and you can work quietly, and you can hyper focus. And But that doesn't mean that these are the only things that we want to do, or the only things that we're good at, or the only things that we're interested in. It's just that other roles maybe have to do the same kind of thing. That other roles have to try and pull out those strengths and, create environments that allow for those strengths to kind of flourish. And I really believe that if organizations take the time to do even relatively small pieces of work in this area, you will immediately start to see some really fantastic skills coming out and some really fantastic talent being attracted to work in those roles. So I think that we need to actively challenge this stereotype that there are ADHD jobs and there are autistic jobs. And we do that, I think, a lot of the time by doing other jobs, right? It's kind of self-fulfilling. But organizations have a role to play in that as well, in that they have to open the door to us to do those jobs. They have to allow us through. And if they do, it will be mutually beneficial. I think we're fairly certain of that.
Yeah, and so you mentioned some small things. So specifically talking to, CTOs, CISOs, tech leaders who probably have, this group of people who have kind of fallen into this role. Um, what are things they can do to kind of support that neurodiverse talent, like small practical things that would make a difference?
Yeah, I think that one of the messages that we really want to stress is that the things that are going to be the most meaningful are often the things that cost nothing and are very easy to implement and are more cultural and emotional than they are practical and financial. And when me and Fred are talking about this to organizations, we will use the language of organizational therapy to talk about this. That really what we're doing is we're helping organizations to self-reflect, to understand themselves, to consider why they react in the way that they do. So there's a list, a huge list of accommodations. Obviously, every person is going to be different, but there are some things that are broadly speaking going to be beneficial. Um, we start with the concept of building flexibility by default, that we create environments where flexibility is where you start, right? You don't start with fixed systems. You start as much as possible with flexibility and then you work from there. That doesn't mean being infinitely flexible, right? There are things that are not possible in certain environments, but it means really critically re-examining which aspects of your role need to be fixed and which could be flexed. And if you feel like they can't be flexed, is that because it actually is impossible, or is that because it makes you feel uncomfortable? And those are different things, right? So we really stress that there needs to be some kind of self-examination. So obviously things like flexible working arrangements and work from home are game changers for neurodivergent people if they are possible. But also in terms of flexibility, just allowing for role carving, so allowing for individuals to trade off aspects of their role that they are better at or worse at, so that you spend more time doing the things you're good at, as do your colleagues, right? You are sharing tasks based on skills and areas of interest rather than on job titles. We also suggest some really simple things like clarity of communication, which a lot of organizations feel they're doing, um, but actually are often not. So that means real clarity about deadlines, real clarity about targets, real clarity about expectations with a real specificity to that. It means things like looking at your recruitment process. So minimizing the need to have a CV application alongside an application form that asks all the same questions. Because I know that for our ADHD colleagues, you may as well ask somebody to climb a mountain before applying for a job than to fill out a
Yeah,
6-page application form. It's an
that's definitely
immediate
fair.
barrier. Yeah. You should offer alternative interview formats to account for struggles with eye contact and things like that. Relaxing of dress codes, that's a real quick win. Relaxing of dress codes, remove the need for restrictive clothing is going to have an immediate impact on those with sensory sensitivities. Offering quiet zones in your offices is a real quick win. Breaking up meetings and having breaks in between and having clarity about what the expectation is for that meeting, agendas in advance and things like that. So as you might be able to tell, I could talk a lot about, the range of different accommodations, but the key point is that a lot of these things are more about culture and they're more about language than they are about spending a lot of money or spending a lot of time. They're all quite quick and easy to implement, but they have immediate, really significant implications.
Yeah, for me as a leader, it's interesting because being neurodivergent, I almost go the opposite way. And then the neurotypicals on my team have struggles sometimes with my leadership because I'll do role carving all day and then I get feedback like, no, I want like more clear role and
Mm,
responsibility. And I'm like,
mm,
well, can't we all just do our job? Like to me, that was something I had to learn as a leader was who needs that clear communication and who needs more independence. Like even when you mentioned the control over sales team, I'm the opposite. Like I just do the sales. Like I don't want to have to be involved in every KPI and I don't want to have to track your every call and email. And that was something I struggled with as a leader was like my sales team needed some of that from me and it was
mm,
not how I wanted to lead. And so it's interesting and the flexibility is something that's really big in my workplace and I lead a team of very different types of people because we do ethical hacking. So we have a team of hackers. And
mm.
business leaders are often surprised that, I don't track their hours. And they're like, "Well, how do you know they're working?" And I'm like, I have to tell them to stop working when they work for 20
Yeah,
hours a day. And
precisely.
especially like in pen testing, because it's like a challenge, like they want to get to the flag. It's like a capture the flag, right? Like you want to get to the game and they'll go until they do it. And I have to be like, guys, stop, stop.
Mm.
We've hit the hours of this test. Now you're just like working extra hours.
And you
So I
found
don't have to
you found the real kind of intrinsic motivation there, right? That we create environments where
exactly.
people do the stuff because they want to do it. And you'll
Mm.
find that there's an abundance of intrinsic motivation in the neurodivergent community, right? That's what motivates us is finding things that we want to do. And then when we get to that point, a lot of neurodivergent people, you wouldn't even need to pay us. We'd just do it. We'd love to do
Right.
it. And we'll do it
Yeah. And I
incredibly
think
well
that's
and we'll do
where
it for long periods of time.
yeah, and you as a leader have to know how you lead because I have an easier time managing a team of hackers who are wild cards than I
Mm.
do managing a sales team who are more people oriented. And
Mm.
for us, it's something that we just talk about openly. Like, I know that this person needs small talk, and she knows that I do not like small talk. So we know that about each other, and we try to meet in the middle somewhere. And I think just open conversations like that are just really the key for me. Like when I bring someone on my team, I have a meeting with them and I'm like, hey, I'm going to cut you off in meetings. I'm going to talk fast. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Like, this is why I do this. And I think just, being open about those things just helps everyone collaborate better.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really interesting things that you've both mentioned. So what you're describing, Valentina, is this process of like, give and take of kind of going like, oh, okay, I think we've gone a little bit too far in that direction. That person's not appreciating that. Let's pull that back. Okay, this person, we need to kind of manage this a little bit better. That that's kind of normal, right? And that's what, in my opinion, really good leaders do. But that in itself is kind of hard. That's like can be uncomfortable. It requires you to be really alert. It requires you to be really notice things that are happening and think about things. And I think a lot of the time, organizations see that what we've just described as like an inefficient use of energy. It's like no. We just need a system. We just need a system so it's the same thing every single time because that's easy to administer, right? But actually, like me and Andy talk about this concept of choosing your discomfort. It's like neuroaffirming workplaces are absolutely not about avoiding discomfort. When you're trying to do something hard, there's always going to be discomfort. But it's like if you choose to avoid the discomfort of having to manage things, having to pay attention, having to make changes, having to adapt, getting it wrong sometimes, right? If you don't want that, then you're choosing a different type of discomfort, which is people not being able to do their best work, people getting frustrated, people getting disillusioned, right? People burning out. Um, and all of this stuff has a direct and measurable effect on a company's success, productivity, innovation, and resilience. So
But
yeah.
in my brain, I can just I just like feel like there's some process out there that will have discomfort. And if I just think about it enough, I can figure out the solution.
Yeah.
That's the challenge,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Well, it
Um,
sounds like you're a really great leader. The way that you think about it and the way that you
yeah,
the awareness that you obviously have about the people that work with you.
No, I appreciate that, and it is something that I struggle with sometimes with other business leaders and just, like, sometimes there's this, just that the startup model where everyone's gotta be working the exact same way and just how businesses operate, and it's hard
Yeah.
challenging that sometimes, but I do see the results in my team and in my team's not just happiness, but productivity and, um, lack of turnover, and so you see the results of those things, but like you said, it causes me a lot of discomfort and,
Yeah.
it's just something you gotta live with, but, that
Yeah.
perfectionism wants to find the find the standard. Um, so I guess um you guys both work now with companies to try to, implement these types of things. Are you guys seeing that being received, or how are you seeing it kind of changing, as we go forward, or since you guys have been working on this?
Yeah. I think that people definitely in the UK, and got evidence that the same is true in America, but obviously America is much, much bigger. And I don't live there. Um, but I think people are starting to appreciate. And it started. Maybe it started for the wrong reasons. Maybe it started from this place where people are being pulled up at work or are getting into like legal problems because people are saying you haven't accommodated my ADHD or my autism. So maybe it's not been motivated by the best things, but I think that workplaces are starting to appreciate. Hang on a minute, like our workforce is neurodiverse. Whether we think that's good or we think it's bad, we have a neurodiverse workforce. How do we work with that? But I think we're still at a very, very early stage.
When I think there's so little, at least in the US, the label of the diagnosis, is so rare that it's like we can't have this conversation because no one's like claiming a diagnosis, and it's like, well, regardless of how you
Mm.
identify or what you've been medically diagnosed with, we think differently. So like we can have this conversation regardless of diagnoses, and I think that's
100%.
where and I think everyone is just like stuck on the diagnosis and the accommodation part, and it's not
Definitely.
about
And
accommodating, it's about using for advantage.
absolutely. And like a good example of that is like, I'm not sure what the diagnostic criteria are in America, but in the UK, it's kind of like you need to exhibit at least 5 of these behaviors associated with autism, for example. What about someone who only exhibits 4? Does that mean that they aren't you don't take those into account? Does that mean that those behaviors mean nothing and you don't accommodate them? It's like, nope, sorry, you need 5. You have to do whatever everyone else does. It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. And then, like I said, so many diagnoses now are just overlapping. Like, I have no idea what's assigned to what part of my brain. Like, I mean, I just, and so to me, it was about kind of letting go the diagnoses a little bit and just learning
Mm,
how my brain thinks.
definitely.
But also, when we talk about like HR or hiring managers, the people that are doing these job interviews, if that person is neurotypical and wants eye contact and doesn't want you to be holding a
Mm,
fidget spinner, and if
mm,
I think it's all about that person too, especially the bigger organizations that have this one person who's doing all the interviews. I think that's a big downside of just the way we hire people, and
Mm.
we're missing out on a
yeah,
lot of that.
Yeah, agreed.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess looking ahead kind of to close out, we talked about it's kind of changing a little bit overall. How do you see this kind of in the future? Like if we get this right, how does this look in 5, 10 years?
I'm sort of
Yeah. Go
go ahead,
ahead,
Fred.
Andy.
Okay, well, I'll speak first, and then we'll do a swap. Okay, I'm sort of a bit of
We're so English,
a bit of a
polite to
relentless
each other.
optimist about this work. I know we are. We take turns here. Um, so I'm a bit of a relentless optimist about this. Almost, I guess, like you could describe me as being delusionally optimistic about this stuff. I tend to think that it's a foregone conclusion that in 15, 20 years, this stuff will be seen as a just good practice, and we'll wonder why we were ever resistant. Um, I think that at the moment we're cresting something. That's how it feels to me, right? It feels like we are cresting something. It feels like awareness is increasing. It feels like understanding is increasing. And when we work with organizations, we get a nice mixture of companies that come to us because they are wanting to do ethical good and moral good, and because they're wanting to be representative and they're wanting to be accessible. But we also get customers increasingly from corporate backgrounds who, yeah, I mean, maybe they are interested in that stuff, but actually the framing of the conversation is, we think this helps us. We think this is of benefits to us and of a strategic good. And I think that that's only going to grow. I can't see that trend reversing. So I tend to believe that, give it 15, 20 years, that we will see a significantly larger group of people diagnosed as neurodivergent. I don't think the numbers will have increased, but I think the diagnosis rates will have increased. I think it will be increasingly normalized as a natural variation in the way that we think. I think that organizations will increasingly see it as a strategic advantage, benefit, and focus. And I think that workplaces in the future will utilize some of these principles that we're talking about and apply it as general good practice. Clarity, flexibility, these are good things for everybody. So I'm incredibly optimistic. I think we're heading in the right direction, and I think we've got exciting times ahead of us. And I think we'll look back on, this period as there being a strange amount of resistance to some fundamentally clearly good ideas.
Yeah, totally agree with everything that Andy said. And there's a couple of things. I mean, that's why starting to do it now is also a bit of a competitive advantage, right? Because it's going to take the wider business community longer. So doing it now means that you're doing things a little bit differently to most of your competitors. And I think there's something really fundamental at the heart of it, which is about trust and autonomy in people. So, this idea of respecting and nurturing intrinsic motivation and allowing it to drive your business. It's going like, people want to do a good job. It's not like kind of because we make them, because we create these kind of systems of carrot and stick. And if we didn't do that, people would just kind of, lie on their couch and watch daytime TV and eat cereal in their pajamas all day. It's when you shift to that mindset, when you shift to this mindset of people want to do well, when you're trying to increase performance, you stop looking for ways of controlling and you start looking for barriers that you can remove. And that's what me and Andy are all about. That's what Irregular is about. It's helping workplaces examine how their workplace works and finding those barriers and removing those barriers. And it's not always easy to remove those barriers. And that's part of the kind of organizational therapy. It's like you don't necessarily want to jump in and just, cut something out, because that can cause trouble. But it's about, right, how do we move towards a place where you're enabling people to do what they want to do?
Yeah, and I know people are listening thinking right now, like, oh, well, there are a bunch of people that want to sit on the couch. But I think that's where, when you're in a hiring position, instead of trying to find someone who makes eye contact, find the people who want to do well. And that's a much better hiring factor. So find the right people for that right role and then let them do their job. So I think the trust is a big thing. It's not that you can trust everyone. It's that that's a better hiring factor.
Yeah.
And then let them do their job.
Yeah. We do trust first, right? You start with a trust first relationship. You assume good intentions, and you respond if people prove you wrong, but you start with trust.
So some of the people that want to sit on the couch, they're really good at crushing interviews.
Yeah, 100%.
True, yeah.
We've had that before. No, it's a really good point. Well, thanks guys for coming on. I mean, this was,
Okay.
really interesting for me to talk through. And I think for a lot of our leaders, I hope that some of this really sinks in or makes them feel seen or, helps them relate to their team more. And for anyone listening, I'm going to link Fred and Andy's information in here. Please reach out to them if you have any questions about this stuff or just how to start implementing this in your workplace and start using it to your advantage. Looking forward to how it evolves over the next few years. So thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Thanks so much for having us, Valentina.
Thank you.
Thank you.